Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate everyone showing up. I'm very excited to introduce this talk, which is on lessons from the pandemic on how to present big ideas and complex data to the public. We will begin with a 20-minute or so presentation from Edouard Mathieu of Our World in Data, followed by a 20-minute fireside chat with Ed and Hannah Ritchie, also from Our World in Data, and we will end with a 20-minute open Q&A session. If you go on SwapCard now to the event, you can start asking questions. The earlier you ask them, the better. So please feel free to begin. So to start by introducing Ed. Ed joined Our World in Data in 2020 as their head of data to oversee the whole chain of collection, transformation, documentation, and dissemination of their data. He previously worked as a data scientist at the University of Oxford, at the Departments of Population Health and Primary Care Health Sciences. He holds a master's degree from Sciences Po Paris. So please join me in welcoming Ed.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So this is, it's been many years since OWID has presented anything to EAG, so I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for showing up. So I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes about various lessons from the pandemic, and also, after that, how we think we can apply some of these lessons to the work we would like to be doing on effective altruist ideas. And then, as Abie said, we'll follow up with a discussion on stage and then a Q&A. As I've already done, I will be shortening Our World in Data to OWID, which is a nickname that too few people know, so feel free to do the same rather than saying Our World in Data all the time. So what we've learned from the pandemic from multiple points of view, we've been working on the pandemic since March of 2020 and on the COVID data in general. This is the data explorer that I guess most of you know. I will assume that most of you know Our World in Data and know this. If you don't, I'm sorry. But I'm going to quickly run through some of the other things that you may not know that we've done in the last couple of years. Initially, early on, we wrote a bunch of articles about various types of metrics to try to explain to people what they should know and what are the various caveats about COVID data. We also have been building for a couple of years now this global data set on COVID data that we publish on GitHub, and that has several dozens of metrics across 200 countries that we update every day. This data set is partly based on data that we take from other sources, like Johns Hopkins University, but we also collect some of the data ourselves, which has been taking the bulk of our time in the last 2 years. The first thing we did was collect the global data on testing, so PCR tests, starting in April of 2020. And then maybe more importantly, in terms of things you might have seen, we've been collecting the global data on COVID vaccinations since the end of 2020. This data has been reused by a lot of organizations around the world, whether they're like large international organizations or media. A few examples include the New York Times, the Financial Times, Google. We've also done some public outreach, sort of, by spending a lot of time on Twitter, tweeting about various things about the pandemic. Here's a couple of examples. Early on, we also did a collaboration to produce a video with Kurzgesagt, the YouTube channel, which led to what's now the most viewed video of their entire channel, with I think close to 100 million views. My colleague Hannah, who will join me on stage soon, was frequently on the BBC. We've written a few opinion pieces to explain some things we think about the pandemic data in general. Our founder, Max Rosa, has testified in front of the UK House of Commons. And finally, and I think much more importantly than all this, is the fact that we got Donald Trump to print out A4 versions of our charts and bring to meetings with him. The first lesson that I want to kind of talk about is the fact that beyond our work, I think in general, COVID has shown to me and to us as a team that we're not quite ready for anything larger than COVID to happen. And in multiple ways, I'll focus mainly on two. The first one is we, as the kind of world in general, we are not ready to handle any kind of crisis in terms of large organizations that we think should be ready for this. I don't think they're quite ready. I think the perception can be that outside of periods of deep crisis, the World Bank, the WHO, the UN are publishing regular data on things. It's good, high-quality data that they maybe update annually. And everything is going quite well, but the time compression of the pandemic has made it almost impossible for these organizations to work efficiently. And so they've had a lot of difficulty just acting fast and taking things into their hands. And one very concrete symptom of this is that almost all of the global data that has been published in the last 2 years has come out not from these organizations, but from private universities. The two main ones being Johns Hopkins University for the cases and deaths, and from Oxford for both Our World in Data and for the OxyGRT project at the Blavatnik School. And this doesn't just apply to large international organizations, but also to national governments, where I've personally been really surprised by the extent to which governments seem to have a poor idea of what is expected to them when this type of data is needed. Most of them focus for months and months on publishing fancy dashboards that they pay a lot of money for, that they don't really know how to update, but they always fail to publish, not always, but they often fail to publish the data that's underlying the dashboard, which makes it very difficult for researchers and journalists and people in general to study the data and analyze it themselves. This thing I just said is mostly about high-income countries, because in low-income countries, the problem is actually much worse. In many poor countries, we actually don't have access to much data, if any data at all. And this creates really weird situations where, for many countries, we still basically have really no idea what the real death toll of the pandemic is and has been. Just to give you a quick example, this is a chart of the total number of excess deaths that have happened in Nigeria. So this is the number of deaths counted that have been in a higher number compared to previous years before the pandemic. And this data is produced by The Economist. And they have a very good model, and their model does as best as they can, but they end up with this confidence interval in gray that tells you that the worst case hypothesis is that 300,000 people died in excess, and the best case hypothesis is that the pandemic, because of restrictions, has actually protected 80,000 people from death. Which is a mad situation where, for one of the largest countries in the world, 2 years in, we're basically unable to say what has really happened, and it's quite possible that we'll never really know how much poor countries have been hit by the pandemic. The second way that I think we've not been ready for the pandemic has been we in the sense of the EA community. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's a quite striking thing, and obviously a relevant thing to talk about here. The main thing is that I think we have surprisingly few concrete plans for how to deal with crises. For people who think constantly about the end of the world and how it's going to happen, we don't really seem to have any idea of what to do if it's about to happen. And the worse the crisis, the problem is that, the worse the crisis, the more the reaction we have in the first few days or the first few weeks will matter. If you think about the idea of the most important century, I think it's quite likely that if this is actually the case, within that most important century, there will also be most important months, if not most important weeks. And our reaction as a community, as a movement, during these few weeks will be extremely important. So one way to think about this is imagine if something much worse than COVID happens, whether it's like a pathogen that would be 10 times deadlier, or whether even on another topic, we get the information through some kind of leak that someone has created an AGI somewhere and that it has significant takeoff capacity. I don't think it's quite clear to anyone in the movement what we would do next and what we would actually advocate for, who would we reach out to, and what we would tell the government of the country, for example. Would we want to shut it down, or would we want to kind of wait and see? And I don't think we quite discussed these things, which is, again, a little weird, given that these things might happen, or at least we think they might happen soon. And so I think from this, we can take the idea that we should use both the COVID pandemic, but also possible future crises that will inevitably happen in the next few years, in the next few decades, to improve our models of how we should react to this type of crisis and what should be the desired reactions of the community. For example, personally, COVID has made me update significantly towards advising people to work in government, and not just in government in the sense of on pandemic preparedness or on AI governments, which are kind of like the obvious cases that we talk about in the community, but also on things that we might think are non-impactful, like, for example, being an advisor to the health minister. Outside of a period of pandemic, we might think, oh, this isn't a terribly high-impact job. You're going to work on some national campaign on communication of maybe something like cancer screening and some health budget. So we probably would advise that as a very impactful job. But the problem is, if you do that, then that means that when the pandemic hits every 20 years or something like that, then the people in the room who will be taking the decisions will be, you know, this group of people who were not quite selected for anything other than being their advisor and who haven't really thought about the decisions that need to be made during a pandemic. I think it also has the sort of bonus aspect of providing a feedback loop for long-termism. The research that we do as a community has notoriously no feedback loop, and it's very hard to know exactly what is the usefulness of what we're doing. And I think that, again, if we think about the other crises that might happen in the future, I think if they all play out and every time they kind of end with the sense that we haven't really been that useful as a community, I think it's fine if it happens once or twice, but I think if it happens every single time, it might be interesting to ask ourselves if something we're doing might not be exactly the thing we need to do. And just as I was thinking about this in recent weeks and months, somebody from FHI actually wrote a wonderful series of posts on the EA forum that I would really recommend that everyone reads about what Jan calls experimental long-termism, and where he also makes the case for building emergency response teams that would be ready and standing by in case of a crisis. The other lesson I want to talk about is that when all of this happens and everything else stops making sense, people seem to value having access to high quality and transparent and impartial sources of information. And obviously my point is that we've tried to make OWID such a source. It's not exactly clear how much we've succeeded, but at least it seems that we've been able to have an impact on the way that people perceive and understand the pandemic in the last couple of years. Some of the ways we've done this that I will try to kind of piece out include building a source that is seen by most people as objective and neutral. One of the ways you can see that is that I think there's few topics on the internet where if people argue fiercely about a topic, they would use the same source to argue on both sides. But it actually happens with COVID, where we frequently see debates on Twitter, which make me really happy because people really disagree a lot, but they both use OWID charts to make their point. Another thing we did is that we really try to focus on our best products, with these products being mostly the Data Explorer that I showed at the beginning and also the database that we have on GitHub. And we try to constantly refine them to make them as perfect and as useful as possible. This also means, conversely, that we had to kind of reject or refuse most of the offers that were made of like media interviews and partnerships and collaborations in the last 2 years. And we probably said no to more than 90% of them, which always feels difficult at the time, but means that we free up more time to focus on the reason why people like our work in the first place. We also try to provide customer service, and by that I mean being extremely attentive to everything that people say on Twitter, on GitHub, by email. I think we are one of the few organizations that actually reads every single piece of user feedback that people send on the website. We don't necessarily reply to everything, but at least if people click on the user feedback button, within the next 24 hours, somebody will actually read that and decide what to do with it. This means that we've also tried to be proactive about adding new things that we think were necessary for the understanding of the pandemic. I think a good example of this is the data on testing, where in March, April of 2020, it appeared that people were not really making sense of case counts and focusing too much on cases and without information on the tests. And so we introduced the positive rate that we try to calculate for as many countries as possible. And also, we tried to not shy away from complex explanations and documentations and things like this. It doesn't mean that everyone should do that. There's definitely a big space for publication that try to get rid of part of the complexity to try to simplify things down. But I think in our case, we take a different approach of trying to make things understandable and accessible, but also trying to keep the complexity within the explanation. I like to think of it as something like the precipice, where you have You have the 200 pages, and then if you want, you can also read 200 pages of footnotes. It's kind of the same thing that we try to do in our articles. And finally, we were fully transparent about our sources and our code and our data and our methods, which I will expand a bit because I think that's a really important thing that more EA organizations could do. I think transparency is too often praised as just a principle. Transparency is good, therefore you should do it. But I think if you're not doing it yet, it's not that useful to say that, and I think we should be talking more about the instrumental values of transparency. For us, for example, one value of transparency is more performative than anything else. It's the fact that by far less than 1% of people who consume content from OWID will ever check the data and the sources and the methods. But the greatest value lies in them knowing that they can and knowing that other people can, and that therefore, if they haven't heard of a huge scandal about our world in data, it most likely means that, so far, things are good and that they can keep trusting our data. It also means that being transparent allows you to accept direct contributions to your data. If you're working in a very close and private manner, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for other people to contribute. But if you work openly, especially on GitHub, it allows people to send you data, to send you more information, which in our case wasn't just a bonus, but meant that part of our work was just made possible. For example, the data on vaccination that I worked on for 6 months, pretty much on my own, would have been basically impossible if I hadn't had help from dozens of people in countries like China and Russia to explain to me what was going on there and kind of like allow me to go over the language barrier. It also means that you have extra pairs of eyes checking what you do, which can sound like a bad idea, but it's actually, I find it personally very reassuring and calming to know that the things I do have been double-checked and double-guessed by other people. And yeah, in the long run, I really think that it really brings value to your work to be able to it's a sort of like permanent peer review process where you know that everything you publish will at some point be checked by somebody you know or a stranger. And in rare cases, fortunately rare, having a permanent record of everything you've ever done on a website like GitHub also means that you can actually answer to people's question if they start accusing you of having changed the data or having changed the code, and there's a permanent record of everything. And again, I think some of these ideas could be used by more EA organizations, not all of them, but definitely some of them. And so probably next week, hopefully, I will be publishing a post on the forum about that with a longer explanation and some possible solutions. Now that we've talked about all this, what's interesting is to think, okay, if we put aside the pandemic for a moment and we think about these principles and how we've tried to build this high-quality, transparent source of information, could we try to do the same thing about effective altruism? So far, the sort of history of OWID and effective altruism has been to mostly serve as input data for things like forum posts and articles and cost-effectiveness analyses and things like this, which has been, I think, bringing a lot of value, both in the sense of providing data on things that matter, but also providing context by, for example, providing data on things that the EA community thinks matters less. So a good example of that is, I think, terrorism, where having very good updated data on terrorist attacks means that we can judge that probably currently charities fighting against terrorist attacks are probably not the best use of our money and time. But if we stop publishing that, and we just publish things on malaria, for example, then kind of like the source would be dry and you wouldn't be able to make these analyses. So it's really important that we do both. That being said, in recent months, we've started working on providing more of a platform for data that really matters to the EA community. And by platform, I mean both platform in the sense of a technical tool, so like our open source tool for graphing data, so that people can make nice charts with their data, but also a platform in the sense of discourse, in the sense of taking data that matters to the EA community and kind of boosting it up so that more people see it. I think the best example of this is this chart on AI training compute that has been produced by several people that you probably know, Jaime, Leonard, Marius, and others, and who published it, I think, late last year. And so we've turned this into a scatter plot that we update frequently, and where people can explore each individual data point on AI training compute. Another good example recently of this is this chart of space launches that was originally mentioned to us by an email from Toby Ord and Finn Morehouse. They told us about the data from the UN, so we ended up scraping the data from the UN and turned it into a bunch of charts that then made their way to the new space governance page on ATK. We have other charts that people often use, like this chart on the cost of sequencing a human genome. Another nice story is from EAG London 2021, where I met with a few people from the lead exposure elimination project, which led to my colleague Hannah writing a series of posts about lead elimination on the website. And even more recently, we worked with the people from CEA to make it possible for people to preview and embed OWID charts on the forum. But I think beyond this sort of platform aspect of the data, we also want to slowly introduce EA ideas on our world in data. The idea is that we can use some of our visibility, some of the reputation we've built and I've talked about, to slowly introduce EA ideas for anything ranging from effective charities all the way to existential risks. There is some potential there because in the last couple of years, we've built quite a large audience of close to 100 million people in the last year and several hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, for example. So there's definitely some potential, especially given that the typical audience of OWID isn't just random people, but it's definitely more quantitatively minded people and people open to new ideas. So the type of people who are usually interested in EA ideas. And so OWID has this potential of becoming a good point of entry into EA, but we want to do this while making sure to always remain the reasonable person in the room. And what I mean by that is that we should make sure we don't skip any steps in the intellectual process of explaining EA ideas. And we should also make sure to not try to convince people or persuade them, but we should mostly inform them of these types of new perspectives about the world and try to see if it manages to convince them. I think this also applies not just to EA ideas as a whole, but also to specific topics. AI is a good example where way before we are able to talk about AGI and AI safety on our world in data, we'll need to talk about AI as it currently exists and things like job automation, for example. If you've missed it, this path has actually begun already with our founder and director, Max Rosa, publishing recently an article about long-termism with these two charts, trying to give a higher perspective on humanity's past and future. Finally, and I'm running out of time, I will quickly tell you about how you can contribute if you're interested in contributing to our world in data. We're currently a team of 23 people in 9 countries. We've grown rapidly in the last couple of years. We were 5, 6 people, I think, before the pandemic, so definitely a sustained growth. We're hiring currently. We have 3 jobs currently open. One is head of product and design. We're also hiring an ops and admin officer and an assistant for Max. So if you're interested in that, please apply. And in general, we always welcome very good applications, so feel free to send us an email, even if it's not for one of these jobs. We're also trying to work on something that people often ask us about, which is making contributions on a smaller scale than joining full-time. So we're working on it, and we're trying to make it possible to volunteer, for example, by contributing on GitHub. We're trying to make it easier by documenting our processes better and kind of pointing people towards the sort of thing they could do to start contributing. We are also part of the 2022 Google Summer of Code, so if you're a programmer, you can look at that. There's a bunch of different projects that you can be working on. And we're also trying to see whether it's possible to build intern programs to welcome interns. Finally, you should come talk to us. There's 4 people from OWID here this weekend. This is less relevant advice, given that the conference is almost over. But maybe if you catch us after the talk or at one of the after parties, you can try and talk to us. And if you don't, then there is this series of posts that I would advise you to read or listen to. The first one especially is the interview by Rob Wiblin of Max on the ATK podcast, and then a series of posts that we published recently. And with that, I would be very happy to answer your questions.
Cool. So thank you so much, Ed, for that amazing presentation. And we're now going to welcome Hannah Ritchie for a Q&A. including with the audience. So please, if you have any questions, open swap card, go to live discussion, and submit any questions. So Hannah joined Our World in Data in 2017, where she works as a senior researcher and head of research. She focuses on the long-term development of food supply, agriculture, energy, and environment, and their compatibility with global development. She completed her PhD in geosciences at the University of Edinburgh. So thank you for joining. So to begin the Q&A, Our World in Data had over 100 million annual visitors in 2021, and I'm curious how you think about your audience and prioritizing your audience. So as you mentioned, you get plenty of journalists who are interested in your work. You also get plenty of academic citations and attention from researchers. I'm curious, when you write articles or create graphs, is that geared toward a specific audience? How do you sort of triage, or do you sort of be audience neutral when you produce content?
I think you're right that we have a very, very broad audience that ranges from just someone that wants to come to the website to find a very simple number and leave, so like the population of the UK, ranges from that to someone that might pivot their whole career towards it. They might share it as a journalist to tens of millions of people, to a policymaker that might completely change a policy based on what they find there. So the spectrum is very, very broad. But I think you might think that we would write and share our work in a very different way for those different audiences, but I think there's actually just two common threads which bind them all together. I think one is that it is always written for a non-expert in that field. I think I myself am a researcher, and I think there's often the temptation, I know personally, to like try to impress colleagues in my field to show how smart I am on climate and environment. That's definitely not the case. In fact, researchers in that specific field are definitely not the target audience. It's everyone else, so writing very much for someone without domain expertise. And I think the second common thread between them all is that I think people nearly always find us through the same avenue, and that's Google. I think we like to think that journalists or policymakers or researchers have like this really special way of finding data, when in fact they just Google. They just Google CO2 emissions, or they Google COVID data or population, and our way of reaching them is to basically get to the top of Google and make sure that what they find when they're searching is good, high quality data. So I think going for a really, really mass audience actually still serves our mission of going for policymakers, journalists, game changers.
And do you do any search engine optimization work to make sure you're at the top of Google, or do you really just let the articles carry?
I think we did it a lot more. I think we're now in the nice position that because we get loads of views, that automatically stuff kind of bubbles to the top of Google. But I think in the past, we very much tried to focus on like what do the keywords need to be in the title, etc., to really get to the top of Google.
Right. So you mentioned that sort of when everything else stops making sense, having just a very objective, high transparency source of data out there in the world can be very valuable. I'm curious how you think about Our World in Data's impact in general. Is it just sort of you follow this rule that having really objective data that's very clear and legible out there sort of tends to produce really good results in the world? Or are there moments where you can sort of trace the impact of a given article, so you know that someone maybe read a graph that maybe would not be out there otherwise, and then made a certain decision that resulted in a good impact? Yeah.
I think some of the like impact metrics are very easy to measure, just like page views. How long does someone spend on the page? I think we would like to lean on those heavily because they're just easy to measure, but I think our biggest impact is somewhat less tangible than that. And I think it's very, very hard to directly trace back a policymaker made this decision because they saw this chart on our data. Realistically, that's not the case, but I think often we're like playing some role in that. But I think that often has to come from more qualitative feedback. So we hear from policymakers that it made a big influence on the decision, or we see from journalists that they're sharing it in their articles, or we hear like crazy stories about people that did a massive career pivot because they saw something was a big problem in our own data. So I think it's very, very hard to like quantify it, but we really know that it's there from qualitative feedback.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious about Our World in Data's affiliation with effective altruism. So sort of what percent of the team is interested in effective altruism, and is that sort of increasing or decreasing? Are there specific problems where you feel like you're sort of engaging more with the community, and other issues where it feels like our world in data is maybe less engaged with effective altruism?
I'll take it. It definitely falls on a spectrum where I think I would be surprised if anyone on the team really strongly disagreed with near-termist ideas and give well type ideas. That would be quite surprising. That being said, most people who joined OWID, I think, historically had not heard of EA when they joined. They are non-EA people. We don't hire EA people specifically. What has happened more often than not, is that people then hear about EA ideas during discussions or like on Slack when we share articles. And so they slowly start being interested in EA ideas. But as soon as you start leaving near-termism and get into long-termism and X risks, we start losing people on the team. And I think if you take something like X risks or AI safety, there are several people on the team definitely very interested in this, myself included. But I think other people are much more interested in the original ideas of OWID about the current state of the world and what the world could look like in, say, 10, 20, 30 years, less so about the year 3000 and Dyson spheres.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm curious to ask more about how our world in data sort of manages being the extremely trustworthy source that it is. So it seems like if someone is interested in just any given stat about global development or sort of any sort of technological trend and they find our world in data, that seems to be the incontrovertible, accurate source. And what goes into sort of maintaining that public reputation? And as you know, if you end up publishing more data and articles about things related to long-termism, then there, I can imagine, be some maybe tension where it's difficult to be like the reasonable person in the room and also talk about sort of more out there ideas related to AI. So I guess both interested in how you sort of think about being and maintaining the trustworthiness of our world in data and sort of how that plays into the direction that you think our world in data is going to go.
I think I could take the first bit and you can say a bit.
Sure.
I think on the first bit, I think actually a lot of it is what Ed touched on the presentation. I think a lot of the ways that we build that trust and keep that trust is one, like just being transparent. So we try to make sure that everyone can see exactly what we're doing, the code, the data. We're not cherry picking specific countries or metrics. We basically try to make it so that you can see the full picture and go and explore the full picture. I think the second element to it is, and I think we would start to be concerned if we saw that users of our data were swaying really closely one way or the other. I think what's been very nice in some ways during most arguments on Twitter or in the public domain is that, as Ed said, people are arguing from both sides based on the central data. I think if we ever reached a position where we were swinging really far one way or the other, I think we would have some alarm bells going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as to how to apply that to long-termism, I think it's definitely a concern, also because the increased visibility we've had in the last couple of years also means we've realized that now if we put something on the website, lots of people associate that with some sort of stamp of approval. If it's on OWID, it's good and you can trust it. And we need to acknowledge that, and we can't really reject that idea, and we need to accept it and be conscious of it. And so for long-termism, that means, I think, being extremely careful about what we put forward, going slowly. Also doing it from this point of view of trying to inform, not persuade, and also trying to always remember what it felt like as somebody who's never heard of these ideas to hear about them for the first time, whether the heuristic is how would I explain my parents this thing, or how would I expect my non-EA friends this thing. And I think this is really important to make sure you don't just take your personal ideas and try to kind of like apply them to people without thinking too much about it. I think another thing is to try to not skip any steps, and that again is a dangerous process when you already know an idea and you want to talk about it. I link it often to the metaphor of the train to crazy town that Ajay Kotra talked about on the ATK podcast, where it's this idea of like when you enter EA, you sort of like jump on a train, and that train takes you from idea to idea. And then at some point, everyone gets off the train and thinks, okay, this is just too much for me. Some people get off really early at like GiveWell, Child in the Pond. Some people get off at X risks, and some people go all the way to like some sort of town where the mayor is on the Sandberg, I guess. But the idea is that we don't really know where we're going to stop on this train. I don't think we've decided that in any way. But the idea is that we should make sure that we stop at every single station, that we don't skip any steps, and that if at any point it seems that we've skipped some steps or people don't understand the rest of the journey, we should slow down and rethink why we're doing this and how we should do it.
Mm-hmm. So you spoke in your presentation about transparency both as a principle unto itself, but also the instrumental reasons for transparency that maybe sometimes get overlooked by other EA organizations. I'm curious what sort of specifically other organizations should do to be more transparent, and then also what you think that the reasons are for the sort of lack of transparency about data right now. Is it primarily this anxiety that someone's going to call me out and check my data, and that's, that can be difficult? Is it, do you think, just like a lack of capacity that organizations simply aren't hiring the right people?
I think it's a bit of everything. I think to be fair, I think the intention is definitely there. I think it would be extremely harsh criticism against EA orgs to say that they don't want to be transparent. By far, on average, EA orgs are much more transparent than non-EA research organizations. That being said, I think in the actual implementation of the transparency, it often looks a lot like traditional academia with kind of stuff that's available on demand, and the data is not quite there, and the code is not quite there. But I think often it just comes down to lack of time. I've been talking to several people this weekend about this who work at these different organizations, and they've all confirmed to me that the main thing is that when you finish a project, of course you could spend 3 days polishing it and documenting it and putting it online, but you also have a project after that, and it always, it never quite seems higher priority to polish this finished project, and you kind of always want to go to the next one. So I think part of it is lack of time and lack of resources. But that being said, I think there's some work that can be done. I think part of it, probably mostly stemming from my situation, is I'm always surprised by how few data scientists are employed by EA organizations in general. I think a lot of them could at least have one who would be probably helping some of these researchers to polish their data set and maybe putting them online after that. Maybe that could be their job. And even just helping these researchers get these skills and teaching them how to use GitHub and why it's not a terrible thing, and the fact that just because you put your code online, people are not going to point at you and laugh. I think these things are true problems, and I think it's definitely we should acknowledge that there's this anxiety that you mentioned of researchers not wanting to put their code online, but I think it's something we can overcome. And the story behind this is that up until 2 years ago, Our World in Data was basically not doing any of this. The code was basically a bunch of data and R files in a Dropbox somewhere. Nothing was really shared. The data was there, but not the code. And there was a lot of opacity in the whole process. And in the last 2 years, we've really worked on making it all transparent. And I think a lot of these organizations are probably at the point where OWID was at 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So basically what Ed is saying is that we were really rubbish until he came on board.
I don't doubt it. So you spoke, I thought you made an excellent point about why it would be really valuable to have people in effective altruism sort of working in positions where, outside of a crisis, it might not actually be super impactful, but in the moment where there is a crisis, they can play a very important role in a hinging moment in a week where lots of crucial decisions are being made. I'm curious how much before the pandemic Our World in Data had sort of taken that lesson to heart and was sort of preparing that for some global event that might require the world to call on Our World in Data to provide all this data. And right now, if you are sort of gearing up in preparation for some, whether it's another pandemic or it could be war, it could be all sorts of global events that would require data. Is Our World in Data sort of preparing for these moments?
I think, so for context, by February, March 2020, we were 5 people, and we actually didn't even have a data team. Research data was one team, and we had one web developer. So you might see we were probably very underprepared for it. I think what kind of saved us in the end, or allowed us to contribute, and I think that's the same, we're in the same situation today in terms of being able to respond to another crisis, actually comes down to funding and how funding's structured. So I think what allowed us to pivot very quickly at that moment was the fact that we had funding for the project as a whole that was flexible enough, that was not tied to a specific research output on a specific topic. So if I was obligated to provide a project on climate or air pollution, etc., by a given date, I would not have been able to pivot in March 2020 to work on COVID pandemic data. And I think it's actually very, very rare, but I hope it becomes more common that more funding is given in this way. It's not tied to a very specific output, because then you have no flexibility in being able to pivot, but giving to good projects as a whole and being able to trust that the people within that project, hopefully with some track record, can make good decisions about how best to use those resources. So I think our World in Data is very much an infrastructure project, and actually the specific research outputs should hopefully be flexible such that if hopefully not another crisis arrives, we could quickly pivot because we're not constrained to a specific output by two months from now.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think there's still one specific thing about trade-offs and the fact that we're still quite a small-ish team, and so everything still feels like a trade-off. So we had this a lot when the war in Ukraine started, where we kind of dropped a few things we were doing to at least make sure that all of our data on things like nuclear weapons and military spending and food supply was completely up to date and accurate. But it's always the type of situations where, yeah, if you do that, that means you're dropping something else. And we're still at this stage where we're making very big trade-offs. And ideally, one of the things we would like to do in the next few years would be to have a more structured team that would have this permanent role of data collection and maybe including like quick response in the case of an event like this.
Mm-hmm. Great. We're going to move now a bit to some audience questions. So one question is, are there any data that you do not have yet that you wish you did?
I'm going to use this to share a bit of a victory. I work in climate energy space, and a big campaign that we've been trying for a couple of years now is basically the really good data on energy is there, but it's provided by the International Energy Agency, which despite being mostly publicly funding, basically paywalls it all. So researchers can't access, well they can, but they have to pay to access it. They then can't share it. Speaking of transparency, they cannot share analyses, etc. Like it's really a mess, and it's really unacceptable that that's the situation. So, and I've really wanted that data for a long time, and we've been campaigning to make it open. And actually, just last month, they've basically approved that they will make it open. So I'm going to go for that.
Excellent. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think for me, there would be a lot of different things, probably related to long-termism and some of the things we mentioned. I think I would like to have much more data about AI, which we're working on, especially my colleague Charlie is working on this, and we're going to start publishing this soon. But even things about pandemic preparedness feels like something where we have some experience now about the topic, and we should definitely be publishing more data. I think what's interesting also is we've sort of collected some of the wish lists of people like Will McCaskill and Toby Ord, which include some very interesting things, some of them quite doable, like the number of days of stock of food in various cities in the world. Some of them are more like the projections on the number of stars in the universe in the future, which I would love to have, and maybe one day in 10 years we'll have that.
Right. Yeah, how do you go about choosing between all these various ideas? I imagine both the team is sort of bursting with ideas of graphs and articles they want to see, and I imagine you get plenty of emails all the time for people asking for specific graphs or articles. So how do you go about prioritizing?
Yeah, it's a struggle in terms of capacity because there's so many good projects and areas we want to cover and just don't have the capacity. I mean, one hopefully solution to that is just to be able to have a bigger team with more funding. I think in terms of like when it comes down to prioritization, I think there's a couple of elements that come into that. One is expertise in the team. So hopefully we would have, even if they're not directly working in that area like a traditional academic researcher would be, they should still have some domain expertise in that area. And then I think another really key aspect of prioritizing is where we think that there's a massive gap and that we could be the ones to fill it. I think what we really don't want to do is duplicate efforts that other people are already doing really, really well. That seems like a real waste. So we will often pick projects because we think it's being kind of undervalued or is not getting the attention that it needs, and I think that would also play into our decisions. Mm-hmm.
Right. So when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, the world relied in many ways on Our World in Data's work. And of course, many decisions before that were being made based on the data produced by Our World in Data. But I imagine it was sort of this enormous increase in the amount of responsibility that you sort of personally felt, that the things you were publishing were really decision relevant, just in a matter of days or weeks. Sort of, how did you deal with that personally, that feeling of, oh my gosh, the work we're putting out into the world is, now extremely consequential?
It feels mostly good, 95% of the time. No, I'm not gonna lie, like it's mostly it's a nice feeling to see your work. I mean, especially for me, my previous jobs never included any kind of like public outputs that people were reusing. So it feels extremely nice to see your work being used by media and organizations in general, and to get this sense that people really like what you do. That being said, there's also this massive increase in visibility, which we had to kind of like, means we had to scale up many of our processes in terms of just the amount of user feedback we got, the amount of people paying attention to our data, which is again, 95% very positive feedback, and sometimes kind of like 5 or like probably less than 5% of people kind of trolling. And so even on things like Twitter, it's definitely also been an increase, especially for me on like my personal account of like getting a lot more visibility. So I think I would say definitely the overall output is very positive, but there's definitely some pressure that you feel. And if you're not quite used to that, the start can be a little bit rough.
Right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think another element to that is also knowing where you should not overstep the mark. I think with the COVID pandemic, there was often lots of requests for us to comment on stuff that we had no position to comment on, because we're not epidemiologists. We shouldn't be on the news talking about that stuff. Like we do the data and we stick to the data, and a really kind of almost like stress relief is knowing I feel in control, I understand this aspect of it that I'm doing, but I'm not going to overstep the line. I think that's when you get into more stressful situations.
Mm-hmm. Right, that makes sense. So several people in the audience are interested to know if there are more Our World in Data collaborations to come, whether that's with Wikipedia or other YouTubers.
We do a lot with Kurt's Gazart, the YouTube channel. I think they do amazing work, and it's like a pleasure to work with them on that. I do that a lot. Other collaborations, I think a struggle for us is just in terms of capacity. There's like so many requests that we would love to do, and I think we often lean towards, and maybe often it's not a great decision, but I think the inclination is to lean towards, if I can't do them all, then I reject them all, because it's a mental struggle to be able to pick really, really specific projects to work on.
I think the other outlet we've done a lot of stuff with is Vox, where we also like a lot of their video content. It seems they strike the same balance in terms of very high quality things, not removing too much of the complexity and being very honest about the state of things, and with a much more dynamic content that we can provide. So yeah, Vox has also been a team we've liked to work with. But yeah, I think now that we kind of like slowly leaving the pandemic, or at least we have less work to do on it, there might be more opportunities to do things like that. And we are definitely in touch with a lot of people, including at Wikipedia, for example. But so far, it hasn't really materialized into anything concrete.
Mm-hmm. Right. Sometimes when I watch the Vox videos and they'll sort of have the visualizations of data, it reminds me very much of the style of Our World in Data. So there have been a few questions about, we spoke about how it might be tricky to both be the reasonable person in the room and discuss, long-termist ideas. And there were a couple other questions about how Our World in Data sort of balances the articles that it produces and the sort of objective data that it puts out into the world, and sort of how much you think about sort of trying to maintain neutrality as you weigh into some of these conversations. So for example, I know that many effective Ultra student groups in their first or second week include the Our World in Data article by Max Roser called something like "The world is much better, the world is awful, the world can be much better," something along these lines. And of course, in some sense, that's very uncontroversial to sort of say that there have been improvements in the human condition over the last 100 years, yet things are very bad right now. And yet in some sense it's sort of making a claim about the world that it has some normative aspect to it at least. So I'm curious how often this comes up when you're writing articles, and sort of looking forward, if you sort of have any takes on how our world in data is going to handle both sort of getting ideas out into the world, but also trying to stay neutral.
Yeah, strangely, I think, I mean, it's definitely an important distinction, but strangely, I don't think we've ever struggled too much with that aspect. I think one thing we clearly try to stay away from is being normative about things that are hotly debated in a country. I think nuclear power is a good example where we make sure that what we do is provide data, and we can say that nuclear power is safe and that it's clean, but we won't write an article that says that, I don't know, Germany should not shut down nuclear power plants, for example. And I think it's really important that we stay away from this particular debate about policy and politics to make sure that we remain neutral. That being said, I think there are other things where the places where we feel much more comfortable being normative are examples where we think something is really neglected. I think the example you mentioned is basically telling people some knowledge which is neglected is the fact that the world is slowly going better, and that yes, it is still awful, but it can become much better in the future. In the same way, Hannah recently published a post on crop yields in Africa, where she stated that it's one of the most important problems in the coming century, which could be said to be normative, but in some way, again, we're just making a claim that it is a neglected problem, and it hasn't led to any backlash, and I would be surprised if it leads to any. So yeah, I think it's definitely on this side, but on any kind of like topical issue, we try to make sure that we don't seem to take any sides. And I think in general, the interactive aspect of our world in data, the fact that people can choose different metrics, can choose different countries, contributes to this idea of not cherry picking information, because if people disagree with one of the charts and they think we've cherry picked information, it's basically up to them to like add some countries and remove some countries, and if they think that there's a good counterexample to something with that, they can actually try to prove it themselves. And so in this way, it's this idea of contributing to people doing their own research, but making sure that they do it with good data and good research.
Yeah, I think as a researcher and a writer on our world in data, I think there's often like a very, very fine line, but we try to very much stay on one side of it. Like I think, so a big part of my work and research is on the environmental impacts of food, and obviously meat is a really fierce topic in that sphere. I would never write an article that says you should eat less meat. What I would do instead is show a chart of the carbon footprint of different food products, and it becomes very clear from the chart. Like we basically try to let the data speak for itself, but never be directive or deliberately persuasive on a given topic.
Right, yeah, I think that also applies to maybe Max Roser's recent article on long-termism, where it didn't, sort of make the case for long-termism, but had all these, very beautiful graphs about how, in the long-run future, that's where we can expect most people to live and so on. And sort of became clear looking at that hourglass that there's a lot of moral stakes to the long-run future, but it sort of wasn't explicitly argued for.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the work on long-termism will look like that, in the sense that there's actually not that much data about long-termism yet, and so it will probably be hard to make charts. But much more than charts, it will be about changing perspectives by doing this kind of like static charts, where you kind of like, it's kind of like in the style of wet but why for the people who know it, where you kind of like try to put things in perspective by zooming in or zooming out, and trying to, shift perspective and tell people, hey, how about we look at it this way, and then what do you think if you look at it this way, but not trying to make a case for long-termism.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So it seems like the pipeline from sort of idea to article or idea to graph at Our World in Data is often crucially reliant on data that's produced either by governments or by academia. I'm curious, sort of especially from your experience with COVID, if there are any improvements you'd like to see to the way that data is reported from academic institutions or governments, and sort of what the sort of main changes you would advocate for would be.
Give us a CSV file. I guess there's two dimensions to where we would get data or run data. One is large institutions publishing, like WHO or FAO and food stuff, them publishing data. Often that's there and it's good and you can navigate it, not maybe as nicely as we would like, but you can get there. I think the other way we get data is by looking at the academic research and research papers. There, I think we can do a much, much better job of being transparent about the analyses that are being done and the publication of the data. It's still the case that most papers will publish the results in a table, in the PDF, in the supplementary file, and then you have to copy it over. For academic research, the code should all be there. The data should be in a single file. I mean, it's really, really simple stuff, but makes a massive difference to that whole pipeline.
Right.
I think on the side of government, I think the pandemic has shown there's a big problem in understanding what type of thing do people need. The incentives are quite wrong in the sense that a lot of people, I think, because they need to report to some type of manager, they would like to show something that looks nice. So they mostly end up like producing a dashboard that looks really cool. And the problem is that often, because of limited resources, they kind of have to choose between a dashboard and an open source file. Now, the UK is actually the one counterexample where the dashboard has been amazing on COVID, and the underlying data has also been amazingly accessible. And so it's led a lot of British people to think that this is the case everywhere, but it's actually the case nowhere. And in a country like France, you actually have good open data, but you don't have any type of dashboard. But in many other countries, the problem is you have this dashboard that people like to look at, but it makes it absolutely impossible for researchers or for us to reuse the data.
Mm-hmm. And does Our World in Data ever attempt to go out and sort of uncover data, do the research itself, or is it sort of always reliant on sort of other groups producing the data?
We don't really do primary data collection, but we do collation. So in the COVID stuff was a key example of that, where some of the data we were just basically taking from Johns Hopkins, so like cases, deaths, etc. But the two ways we did contribute in data collation was the testing database and the vaccination database, and that was literally picking the data from every single country, whether that's on a YouTube video or a PNG file on Facebook or a really nice API.
Cool. Yeah. Cool. So we only have a few minutes left. I'm curious to ask if things go sort of exceptionally well for Our World in Data over the next 5 years, what do you think that looks like? And sort of in the world in 5 years where things are going exceptionally well, how does Our World in Data look different from it does today? Differently?
I think hopefully we'll be much bigger, and one of the benefits of being bigger is, as we said, there's so many projects that we would just really love to work on and just have to reject almost 90% of them because we just don't have capacity to do that. I think on the research side, one really big change and contribution I think we could make and we should make is that I think we do pretty well at revealing the data that's already there and the research that's already there. What we don't do well at, and I think we should do much better, is highlighting what's not there. And what are the key open questions in research? What are the key data sets that we don't have? I think for a couple of reasons. One is so researchers at events like this know these are the open questions in this field and this is where I can contribute. And also for funding. So funders know these are the key areas where we just don't have the research and they can better prioritize where to allocate those resources.
I think on the data side, one big thing would be to be able to do more data collection when we think that we can do it. I think it's actually been a big shift of the last 2 years I think before the pandemic, Our World in Data was mostly about the content and the charts, and it was served by data. And now we've seen in the last 2 years that actually data itself can be an end product. Actually, in the last 12 months, we have barely published any article about COVID. We've stopped writing about it. It's just been about the charts and the data. And so it has shown us that actually we don't necessarily need to always analyze things. We don't need the research team. We can just collect data and make it available. And that's like, we basically now also see data as a sort of end product in and of itself. And I think if we can think of ideas of places where we could start collecting data ourselves because we think it's missing, that could be really valuable. And I think beyond both research and data, I think there's the question of like the type of outputs that we have. And it's something I discuss a lot with people at EAG often, where lots of people have ideas about the fact that OWID should, should make videos or should have a podcast or we should write a book or we should have online courses or things like that. And the good news is that we kind of want to do all of these things, maybe not the book, but the rest of it, and that we don't think of ourselves as constrained by any kind of output. We could be doing all of these things if we had the time and the funding and the resources. And so I guess that in 5 years, one of the things that could go wonderfully well was that we would be in a situation where we could launch these things without thinking of them as a huge trade-off with our current work.
Mm-hmm. So the research team is getting sacked, but I'm going to start a podcast. That's 5 years from now.
Excellent. You can be the Rob Evelyn of Our World in Data. Cool. Great. Well, thank you both so much. This was an excellent conversation. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.